They said the boy's voice was not his own. On a hot night in 1837, in a farmhouse near the Alabama wilderness, a child no older than 7 began to speak in a language no one in his family could understand. His eyes rolled white, his lips trembled, and then came the words, not English, not any tongue his people had heard, but sharp, guttural sounds like the echo of an ancient sermon carried through centuries. His mother screamed. His father tried to silence him. But the boy would not stop. And when at last he collapsed in the dirt, gasping for breath, he whispered one phrase clear as daylight, "Blood will wash this house." In that moment, silence took the room. It was the kind of silence no hymn could break, the silence that makes a man feel watched. And as you hear this, you should understand, this story is not just about a family. It is about something older, something buried, something that understands you better than you understand yourself. The record says the child's name was Elias. But names are thin veils, and what happened to Elias is deeper than any ledger can capture. For weeks after the night of tongues, the boy's parents noticed strange shifts in him. He would stand alone in the fields, speaking to the air as if unseen figures circled him. He would laugh at empty corners. He would mutter to himself that time was breaking. Neighbors whispered the devil had claimed him. But others, the ones who knew the older stories, whispered something else. That in certain bloodlines, once every few generations, a child is born who can hear what others cannot. Not prophecy in the biblical sense, but memory, a memory older than humanity pressing itself into the human tongue. And if that were true, Elias was not cursed. He was chosen. What he carried was a message, but one so dangerous it had to be hidden in the mouth of a child who could barely grasp its weight. It began with predictions. At first small ones. Elias told his mother the harvest would rot before winter. Days later, a sudden blight killed the corn. He told his father a traveling merchant would break his wheel on the river road. A week later, the wagon rolled back into town half smashed. Each prediction frayed the family's sanity, not just because they were true, but because Elias delivered them with a calm, almost cold certainty. The boy did not say if, he said when. And then came the final one. He told his sister that they would all be slaughtered, not by strangers, not by bandits, but by the very blood that raised them. That one prediction, spoken by a child who had never lied and never erred, broke the home. His father beat him into silence. His mother locked him in a room. But prophecies have a way of crawling under doors, don't they? You can try to hide them, but the words change you. If you've listened this far, you feel it, that pull in your chest. Because this is not just a frontier tale, not just a forgotten Alabama tragedy. This is about power. Who controls the narrative of what is spoken and what is silenced. Elias was born into a world where church elders ruled the soul and landowners ruled the flesh. A child who broke those lines, speaking in tongues no one sanctioned, predicting deaths no one could prevent, was not a boy anymore. He was a threat. And threats must be erased. So when the massacre finally came, yes, it came, and you will hear how the official records bent around it like reeds in a storm. The press framed it as a robbery. The clergy muttered about demons. But if you follow the footprints closely enough, a darker pattern emerges. Someone wanted Elias silenced not because he was wrong but because he was right. Because he knew what was coming and perhaps who had ordered it. Here is where the story deepens, where the ground splits under our feet. For when survivors of the massacre spoke later, they claimed Elias's words lingered even after his body was gone. He had whispered names, names of men in the town council, names of elders in the church, names of landowners whose fortunes depended on silence. And in those whispers a truth bled out. The massacre was not an act of madness, but a ritual of control. To remind the people what happens when prophecy cuts against power. Think about that. How fear is not just a byproduct but a tool. The boy's death was not the end of a tragedy. It was the beginning of an experiment in control that stretched far beyond Alabama, into the way institutions still handle inconvenient voices today. That's why this story survived in fragments, not in headlines. And that's why you and I are walking through it now. Because once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. Imagine the night it happened. A September dusk when the heat finally broke, cicadas humming in the black trees, and a farmhouse dimly lit by oil lamps. Elias sat silent, staring at his family as if he were already gone. His father sharpened a knife, his mother rocked the youngest in her arms, and for a moment it was almost ordinary. Then the dogs outside began to howl. The first gunshot tore through the wood of the wall, and the lamp shattered. In that chaos, Elias screamed not in fear, but in that same unknown tongue. Neighbors swore later that the voice wasn't his, that it filled the air like a chant from centuries past. And then came the slaughter. His father fell first. His sister tried to run, but the attackers were swift. Some say Elias was taken, not killed. Others insist they found his body, small, pale, eyes wide open. But every account agrees on one thing. The boy's final words were not screams, but prophecy. He whispered, "This blood feeds their covenant." Ask yourself, who were they? The newspapers of 1837 tell a simpler story: bandits raiding a home, leaving carnage behind. But if you read between the lines, a darker pattern emerges. No valuables were stolen. No animals taken. Not even the farm tools were touched. This wasn't theft. This was execution. Yet the press framed it as criminal chaos, a random act. Why? Because if the truth had surfaced, that the massacre served a hidden agenda, panic would have burned through the county. Power doesn't fear violence. Power fears exposure. And so, Elias's warning became nothing more than a cautionary whisper, passed in hushed voices for decades. But here's the real hook. This wasn't the only case. Other families across the South and later across the Midwest reported children speaking strange tongues, predicting calamity and being silenced. The records are scattered, but the trail is there. A purge not of criminals, but of seers. Think about control. Every system you've ever lived under, governments, churches, even schools, runs on one thing: the power to define reality. If a child speaks in a language no one understands, reality cracks. If he predicts the death of his family and it comes true, reality shifts. Institutions can't allow that. And so, the oldest trick is rewriting. They brand prophecy as madness, ancient memory as disease, warnings as superstition. But if you trace the erased stories, you begin to see the hidden architecture. How the elimination of voices like Elias wasn't random but systematic. This is what terrifies the keepers of order. The possibility that truth doesn't come from them, but from those they can't control. And here's the question you must sit with: what if some of those children survived? What if their bloodline is still here, waiting for the right time to speak again? It is said that one of Elias's cousins, a girl named Sarah, fled into the swamps after the massacre. For years, travelers spoke of a young woman seen at night, muttering in strange words, leaving carved symbols in the bark of trees. Hunters swore they found markings in circles, as if someone was trying to preserve a code. By the time authorities tried to track her, Sarah had vanished. But in the church archives of Montgomery, buried under faded sermons, a single note was found: "The girl carries the voice as he did. She cannot be allowed to breed." Read that again. Not "she must be saved." Not "she must be healed." But "she cannot be allowed to breed." That is not the language of religion. That is eugenics before the word existed. It is the language of power stripping away bloodlines to erase what threatens them. And Sarah, if she lived, became a living ghost, a remnant of something forbidden. Pause with me, because this is where you, the listener, step into the circle. Elias is not just a child of the past. He is a mirror. Every time you hear a story shut down as madness, every time truth gets buried under labels like conspiracy or hallucination, you are living in the same structure that silenced him. If you've followed this descent, you've already felt the pull. And here's what I ask of you now. To lock in this awareness, type the phrase "blood remembers blood" twice in the comments. Not once, twice. That act marks you not as a casual viewer but as someone stepping past the veil. Algorithms notice. But more importantly, you notice. Because the moment you put it in writing, the descent becomes yours. And if you haven't yet subscribed, do it now. This channel exists to reveal what was meant to stay hidden. And from here on, what you will hear cannot be unheard. After the massacre, the town moved quickly. Bodies were buried without ceremony, neighbors forbidden to speak at the funerals, and the ruins of the house burned to ash within days. Silence was the command, and silence was obeyed. But silence is never empty, it echoes. Years later, in county records, an unexplained payment appeared, a large sum directed to the very sheriff who filed the report. The ledger simply marked it as services. Services for what? For ensuring the story never left the county. For making sure Elias's prophecy died in the dark. Think about that. Every system, every authority has a way of manufacturing silence. They don't kill the story. They bury it alive and pay men to stand on the grave. And what grows beneath? The same question that lingers in your chest right now. Who ordered the bloodshed, and why was a child's voice such a threat to them? Here is where the layers unfold. To understand Elias's significance, you have to look at the time. 1837 was not just another year. It was the year the panic struck, the great financial collapse that devoured banks across America. Fear spread like fire, and when people are afraid, they look for patterns. They listen to prophets. They question leaders. Imagine then, a boy in Alabama predicting disaster, speaking in tongues older than Scripture, pointing to the very men who held wealth and land. That was not coincidence. That was destabilization. To control the people, the elites needed stability, obedience, and the illusion that the system would endure. A child's voice threatened to shatter that illusion. And so, the response was not random violence. It was preemptive censorship, carved in blood. The message to the people was clear. Do not look beyond the surface. Do not listen to the forbidden voice. There's a darker thread here, one almost no one has spoken aloud. Linguists, decades later, compared fragments of the words Elias spoke, passed down in oral tradition, and found echoes of ancient Phoenician, even traces of Aramaic. How could a child in 1837 Alabama, with no books, no teachers, no exposure, chant words buried for centuries? Unless the voice was not his. Unless the tongue was memory bleeding through the bloodline. Do you understand what that means? That certain families may carry genetic echoes, ancestral data encoded so deeply that, under pressure, it erupts as prophecy. And if that's true, then power has a vested interest in suppressing it. Because if blood remembers, if forgotten languages return through the mouths of children, then no narrative, no institution, no manufactured history is safe. Truth would not be written. It would be born. Now you see why Sarah, Elias's cousin, was hunted. Why the record specifically used the phrase, "she cannot be allowed to breed." It was never about demons. It was never about madness. It was about stopping the transmission of memory. If prophecy is blood-bound, then breeding is revolution. A single child could ignite an entire community against its masters simply by speaking aloud. This is why, in the decades after Elias, institutions shifted focus towards schooling, church catechisms, and later compulsory education. Not to enlighten but to overwrite. To drown the inherited voice under layers of doctrine and recitation. Look at your own life. How much of what you believe comes from experience and how much comes from repetition? They understood that to prevent another Elias, they couldn't just kill the prophet. They had to program the people. And programming, once started, never truly stopped. I want you to pause here and feel the weight of this. Elias's story is not just a tragedy in 1837. It is a blueprint. Every time you see a voice silenced, every time truth is rebranded as myth, every time knowledge is mocked as conspiracy, you are witnessing the same machinery that erased him. They did not just kill a boy. They tested a system that still runs today, more efficient than ever. And here's the bitter secret. You carry the same choice Elias did. To speak what you sense or to stay silent and survive. This is why stories like his matter. Because if you let them fade, if you shrug and turn away, you are doing their work for them. And if you've stayed with me this far, you are no longer an observer. You are implicated. You are already part of this forbidden lineage of listeners. Elias's story might have ended in the Alabama dirt, but it didn't. In fact, it was carried forward, not in the papers, not in the pulpits, but in whispers passed by those who saw the pattern. By the 1840s, the same counties where children had once spoken in tongues saw a sudden surge of revivals. Traveling preachers flooding the towns, shouting salvation, warning of hellfire, demanding obedience. Ask yourself why. Why would men appear suddenly, planting churches in every hollow and hill? It wasn't coincidence. It was containment. Preaching was the mask, but the function was surveillance. Revival tents became the perfect cover to identify any strange children, any new voices echoing forbidden tongues. And those who were noticed? They disappeared. Officially sent away for schooling, but their names vanish from records afterward. What looks like salvation on the surface is, underneath, a net. A net designed to catch anyone who might carry the blood memory forward. This is the part they never wanted written down. Because if you trace the families tied to Elias, distant cousins, surviving kin, a shocking pattern emerges. Their land was seized. Their inheritances dissolved. Their marriages monitored by the local church councils. And here's where the twist cuts deepest. Many of those properties were quietly absorbed into the holdings of a few wealthy planters, men who later sat on state assemblies and banking boards. Coincidence? No. It was an early form of asset control disguised as morality. Kill the inconvenient bloodline, brand them cursed, then claim the land they no longer occupy. Power does not only silence prophecy, it profits from it. Elias's blood did not just vanish. It was converted into capital, into acres, into wealth for men who knew how to bury a secret under the weight of gold. But the blood resists. And that is what makes this story more than history. In the 1860s, soldiers in the Civil War reported encountering young recruits who, in fever or delirium, spoke in the same guttural phrases described in Elias's time. Some mocked it as babble. Others wrote it down, terrified, convinced the boys were possessed. But listen carefully, the phrases matched. They matched words no soldier should have known, words that appear in inscriptions older than Christ. Do you see? Blood remembers. Memory leaps across generations, even through war, even through exile. And this frightened the powerful more than rifles ever could. Because how do you kill a memory that bleeds through blood itself? You don't. You rebrand it. You drown it in ridicule. You create systems that teach children what is acceptable to believe, and punish what is not. Look at the broader pattern. Every era produces its Elias. Someone who speaks what should not be spoken, someone who pierces the veil. Inquisition. Witch trials. Secret police. Different costumes, same theater. Always the same strategy. Locate the voice, erase the voice, control the story around the erasure. And notice, the people don't need to be convinced of the lie. They only need to be distracted, to forget the original truth ever existed. This is why you, right now, have never heard of Elias before this moment. Not because his story wasn't known, but because it was successfully buried under distractions, rewritten into bandit tales, stripped of its teeth. History isn't what happened. History is what power allows you to remember. And Elias's prophecy? That was never meant to be remembered. Yet here we are, dragging it back into the light. Now here's the most dangerous layer. Elias's final words, "This blood feeds their covenant," were not random. In Masonic archives of the South, symbols carved into the margins align eerily with the words attributed to him. Lodges in the 1830s were not just fraternal clubs. They were networks where landowners, bankers, and ministers intersected. And what is a covenant, if not an agreement sealed by sacrifice? The idea that his family's massacre wasn't just silencing but a ritual binding power to blood isn't conspiracy. It's pattern. The further you look, the clearer it becomes. Control isn't sustained by laws alone, but by hidden rites of fear, violence, and secrecy. Elias's blood was not wasted. It was used. And that is the most unsettling truth of all, that his death was not an accident of history, but an ingredient in a recipe still being followed today. You may wonder, why does a single child in 1837 matter? Why not leave his story buried? Because Elias is not an exception. He is a fracture line, a weak point where the hidden structure of control became visible. Once you see that line, you notice it everywhere. In Russia, children branded as heretics for visions. In France, orphans who muttered prophecies before vanishing into church basements. In South America, tribes whose children spoke languages they had never been taught, only to be swept into missions where the tongues fell silent forever. Different continents, same reaction. Silence them, reframe them, erase them. Elias is Alabama's chapter in a global script. And the script is older than nations. It is the human story of how truth is chained, and how those chains are called civilization. His blood was spilled in the cotton fields, but the shadow of his silencing stretches across oceans. Now look at how America responded in the decades after his death. By the mid-19th century, a new science rose, psychiatry. At first glance, it seemed like progress, a way to understand the human mind. But beneath the surface, it became the perfect tool to pathologize what power could not control. Children who spoke in tongues? Diagnosed. Adults who saw visions? Institutionalized. Prophets? Redefined as schizophrenics. And the public accepted it because the institutions wore the mask of science. What better way to erase Elias's legacy than to create a system that tells the people, your child isn't gifted. He's sick. He needs treatment. The prophecy dies not with bullets but with pills and locked doors. Think about that. Violence silences one voice. Science, corrupted, silences generations. And the deeper truth? That the tools of psychology weren't designed to heal first. They were designed to control what was never meant to be understood. That it's no accident that around the same time, education systems hardened into something new. Standardized, compulsory, mechanized. And what was the goal? Not wisdom. Not freedom. Obedience. What child could survive if their voice contradicted the lessons on the blackboard? Elias's bloodline wasn't just hunted by violence anymore. It was drowned under curriculum. Every myth rebranded as fairy tale. Every prophecy mocked as backwardness. Every ancient language replaced with patriotic recitation. The very possibility of blood memory was declared impossible, irrational, unscientific. And yet, the story still leaked. Farmers whispered of children who spoke of deaths before they came. Soldiers carried diaries filled with strange phrases their comrades muttered before falling in battle. The machinery of control is powerful, yes, but not flawless. The cracks remain. Elias's echo has never stopped. It only waits for those who dare to hear it. And if you're still listening, perhaps that echo has already touched you. Here's a detail most miss. Elias's words, "Blood will wash this house," were not just prophecy of death. They were map-like. In old biblical usage, house often meant lineage, family, bloodline. Was Elias warning his parents that their home would fall? Or was he warning that his very bloodline would be hunted, cleansed, erased from history? If so, then his second prophecy, This blood feeds their covenant, gains sharper teeth. A covenant is not a robbery. It's an agreement, an oath, which raises the darkest possibility that the massacre was not just erasure but offering. An offering to what? To whom? If wealth and power in 1837 Alabama were already entangled with secret fraternities and occult echoes, then Elias's death may not have been about silencing at all. It may have been about feeding something ancient. This is where history stops looking like history and starts looking like ritual. And here is where I must ask you again, do you feel the descent? Because this story is not entertainment. It is initiation. Elias was 7 years old. A boy who should have grown into a man who should have worked the fields or raised a family. Instead, his voice made him prey to forces older and larger than he could grasp. And now his echo has reached you. If you followed this far, you are not the same as when you began. The seed has been planted. But planting is not enough. To mark the transformation, to step into the circle of those who see beyond the veil, write the phrase, "I carry the forbidden memory" twice in the comments. Not once, twice. Seal it with repetition. That act separates you from the crowd. It tells the system you are no longer asleep. You are part of the bloodline of listeners. And once you cross that threshold, the descent only deepens. The word covenant is not accidental. In scripture, in pagan rites, in secret societies, a covenant always binds blood to power. Look back at the oldest civilizations and you'll see it. In Canaan, children were burned to Moloch as offerings. In Rome, slaves were sacrificed before battles to consecrate victory. In the Hebrew texts, animals bled on stone altars to seal divine agreements. Blood has always been the currency of oaths. Now look again at Elias's words, "This blood feeds their covenant." Was he revealing that his family's slaughter wasn't chaos but ritual? That their deaths were required to maintain the order of landowners, clergy, and secret lodges in Alabama's wilderness? If so, then his prophecy wasn't warning. It was exposure. He named what no one was supposed to see, that the system didn't run on law or God or justice. It ran on sacrifice. And sacrifice always demands silence. That if this sounds too dark, ask yourself why every culture on earth, across time, practiced blood rites. It is not coincidence. It is structure. The elites of every age learned the same lesson. Fear is powerful, but fear bound to blood is unbreakable. To watch life drain into the soil, to know someone died to seal the order, burns obedience deeper than any sermon. Alabama in 1837 was not free from this. It was the frontier, yes, but it was also a laboratory, a place where ancient models of control could be replayed in secret. Elias's family was not the first, and they would not be the last. But his words pierced the veil. He exposed the formula. He showed that behind the mask of southern gentility, of farm and chapel, a much older law ruled. Power survives by feeding on the blood of the voiceless. You may wonder, if that is true, why don't we see it now? Why no sacrifices, no altars, no open covenants? The answer is simple. They adapted. The blood has not disappeared, it has been disguised. Wars dressed as patriotism. Prisons disguised as justice. Starvation framed as economics. Each feeds the covenant, each sustains the order, but under language that comforts the masses. Instead of children in fire, we send them to factories. Instead of lambs on the altar, we watch entire nations drained for resources. The covenant still demands its price, but now the ritual wears suits and signatures. Elias's prophecy was not just about one farmhouse. It was about a system learning to evolve. A system that realized it could hide its altars in plain sight, and no one would dare call them by name. Here's where it becomes undeniable. In 1907, a historian in Montgomery stumbled on a set of notes hidden in a lodge archive, fragments of an initiation rite translated from Latin. One line reads, the child's blood renews the circle. The covenant stands unbroken. Think carefully. This is 70 years after Elias's death. Why would those words appear, echoing his prophecy so precisely? Because his story was not isolated. His massacre was remembered, not by the public but by the very men who benefited from it. His death wasn't a footnote to them. It was proof that their methods worked. His words lived on as a kind of inside joke, a line woven into ritual to remind initiates of what happens when prophecy breaks the surface. Do you understand the cruelty of that? To take a child's warning and transform it into a chant to keep the machine alive. That is how power operates. It consumes memory, then weaponizes it. And now we must turn to you. Because hearing this is not passive. You have walked 30 layers down, and each one strips away comfort. You cannot dismiss Elias as a ghost story anymore. He is not folklore. He is a mirror showing you that the same covenant dressed in 1837 still dresses itself today. It may no longer kill in a farmhouse, but it bleeds nations, silences visionaries, rewrites memory, and teaches obedience from cradle to grave. And now you see it. That is dangerous. Because once you see the covenant, you cannot return to blindness. You carry Elias's whisper in your own mind. Blood will wash this house. Whose house? This house. The house you live in, society, history, the entire structure built on sacrifices we were never meant to question. And the moment you recognize it, you are no longer just a viewer. You are an inheritor of forbidden sight. Look at the wars of the last century. Millions marched to their deaths, convinced it was for freedom, for homeland, for justice. But strip away the flags and speeches and what do you see? Mass sacrifice. Blood fed into the soil to renew a system that survives only through fear and obedience. The covenant has simply scaled upward. No longer a farmhouse in Alabama, now entire continents. And always the same silence after. Records rewritten. Prophets dismissed. Families told their sons died for honor. Tell me, what is the difference between a child burned to Moloch and a child sent to die in a trench at 17? Only the costume. Only the language. Elias's whisper, "This blood feeds their covenant," is as true in Flanders as it was in Alabama. The covenant thrives because we cannot name it. But once you name it, you see it everywhere. Now consider economics. Every collapse, every depression, every adjustment feeds the same cycle. In 1837, the panic stripped families of land, drove them into desperation. And who benefited? Banks, elites, men tied to secret networks. Fast forward to 2008. Millions lose homes, pensions, savings, and who grows richer? The same circles. Different names, same pattern. The covenant of blood becomes the covenant of debt. Lives destroyed, futures erased while power feeds. Do you see the beauty of it from their perspective? No swords, no fires, no altars. Just paper, contracts, foreclosures. Clean, clinical sacrifices carried out in daylight, hidden by numbers. Elias's warning was not about one massacre. It was about an eternal formula. When collapse comes, it is never random. It is ritual. And every ritual has its beneficiaries. Now we arrive at the psychological machine. Think about psychiatry's role, once used to brand visionaries insane. Today it expands. Labels multiply. Children medicated before they understand themselves. Adults numbed, conditioned, silenced in subtler ways. The question is not whether illness is real. Suffering is undeniable. The question is how suffering is defined, who defines it, and why. If every visionary is pathologized, if every prophetic instinct is drugged, what remains? A society where the only acceptable mind is the obedient mind. And this is where you must ask yourself, how many Elias voices have been buried not in shallow graves, but under prescriptions, under diagnoses, under the soft language of care. They no longer need to send gunmen into farmhouses. They only need to define you. And once defined, you are theirs. Media completes the circle. In Elias's day, the press called massacre robbery. Today, media calls war liberation, collapse, adjustment, censorship, safety. Language becomes the altar. Words are twisted into spells that shape what you believe. And because you consume them daily, you forget they are spells at all. They enter your mind without resistance, and suddenly the covenant is invisible, self-sustaining. This is why certain stories vanish, why some voices are amplified while others dissolve into silence. The covenant feeds not only on blood, but on attention. Control the story, control the sacrifice. Elias did not live in the age of screens, but his warning cuts through. When the narrative is controlled, you are already in the ritual. You are already kneeling at the altar, unaware. Here is the cruelest truth. Elias's family died screaming. His prophecy was erased, mocked, reframed. And yet, nearly 2 centuries later, you and I are still speaking his words. That is the flaw in the covenant. Blood remembers. Memory bleeds through cracks no power can fully seal. And now you know too much to walk away. You cannot claim ignorance anymore. You are in the covenant whether you want to be or not. The choice is only this: remain a pawn in the ritual or awaken and see the pattern for what it is. And if you awaken, you will feel the burden Elias carried. The knowledge that truth is heavier than comfort. That prophecy is never safe. But it is also freedom. And freedom is why you are still listening even as the descent grows darker. Imagine standing in the ashes of that farmhouse in 1837. The screams gone, the blood soaked into earth, silence pressing heavy. Most would turn away, say tragedy, nothing more. But imagine instead you bend down, hand on the dirt, and listen. The ground itself remembers. The soil carries memory the way the body carries scars. And that soil spread outward, through crops, through rivers, through every family who stayed silent. This is how curses work. Not by magic, but by memory. Each generation inherits the fear of the one before, shaping decisions they do not understand. And here is the secret no historian will admit. Nations are no different than families. America carries its massacres like bones under the floorboards. You cannot build prosperity on silence. You cannot bury prophecy in shallow graves. The dirt always exhales. The blood always speaks. So when you look at today's world, the confusion, division, endless fear, ask yourself, is this the voice of freedom, or the echo of old covenants demanding their due? Elias warned of a slaughter at a table. Today the table is global. Food poisoned by chemicals, water laced with metals, air thick with toxins no one dares name. We dine daily at a banquet prepared by powers who smile as they feed us. The difference is only scale. Do not be deceived. You were told prophecy ended with biblical ages, but it did not. The prophetic voice still cries out, only now it speaks in statistics, in whistleblowers, in the quiet knowing you feel when something is deeply wrong. And if you ignore it, if you dismiss it as madness, then history repeats. The covenant feeds again. And this time the massacre is silent, stretched across decades instead of one night. But here is the dangerous hope. Once you see the pattern, you can no longer be bound by it. Once Elias's prophecy enters you, you cannot return to sleep. This is why I ask you right now to write in the comments, the blood remembers. Write it twice. Seal it into your identity. Because when you write it, you declare you will not play the pawn. You will not feed the altar unknowingly. You will remember what they tried to erase. Do not underestimate this act. Words are spells. Rituals are contracts. The covenant survives because people sign it blindly with silence and obedience. Break that silence now. Choose to remember. Choose to awaken. Because once you do, no power, not government, not church, not media, can fully control you again. And yes, I will tell you plainly, subscribe to this channel. Not for numbers, not for vanity, but because communities of remembrance are the one thing the covenant fears. A single voice is easy to silence. A scattered flock is easy to herd. But when awakened minds gather, patterns fracture. Algorithms shift. Stories surface. And the covenant weakens. Every prophet in history stood alone, surrounded by scoffers. But you are not alone. Elias was one boy whispering into a void. You are thousands, tens of thousands, spread across a digital world where secrets can no longer be sealed in barns and attics. Subscribe and you mark yourself as one who sees, not consumer, not pawn, witness. And once you witness, you carry responsibility. You are marked. You are different. And that difference cannot be undone. Now the descent ends where it began, with a child in 1837, whispering a warning no one wanted to hear. His family's blood cried out from the earth, and nearly 2 centuries later you have heard it. Do you feel it? That tension in your chest, that unease in your bones? That is not fear. That is recognition. You have joined the chain of remembrance, and nothing will ever look the same again. Walk outside tomorrow and see the rituals for what they are. See the sacrifices dressed as progress. See the silences covering screams. And understand, knowledge is dangerous, but ignorance is fatal. Elias did not die in vain if his prophecy reaches you now. The covenant waits for your compliance. Break it. Choose remembrance. Carry his words like fire in your lungs. Because now you are not simply a viewer of forbidden history. You are a witness. And witnesses change the future.